Hey everyone, it's Ashley from Prevent Connect. Here are two truths I know about life. Number one, technology doesn't always work. And number two, technology is guaranteed not to work when you've recorded a really great conversation. And with that, I present to you part one of a conversation with the Oregon Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force and the Oregon Law Center, looking at Oregon's rent stabilization law and how housing protections help advance sexual and domestic violence prevention. We truly apologize for the echo, and if you just can't bear it, please check out the transcript of the conversation. In part two, we'll be looking more closely at the collaboration, partnerships, and how to change conditions to prevent sexual and domestic violence. So stay tuned for that. Enjoy. First of all, Michelle and Sybil, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation. And I think it would be great to just start with if you both could give a little bit of background about your organizations. I know, Michelle, you're with the Oregon Attorney General's Sexual Assault Task Force, and Sybil, you are with the Oregon Law Center. So if you could just give our listeners just a little background about your organizations.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashley and Tori, for inviting us to chat today. This is Michelle with the Oregon Attorney General Sexual Assault Task Force. And we are a statewide private nonprofit organization. We have over 100 multidisciplinary members who are appointed by our Attorney General to the Sexual Assault Task Force. And they serve on one of 8 subcommittees and come together in what I like to think of as kind of a think tank that helps inform our work, inform the training that we offer statewide and nationally, inform the kind of technical assistance that we offer to first responders, preventionists, and others in the community, and then of course inform our policy work. And we've been around for almost 20 years and really excited to bring folks together to help improve Oregon's response to and prevention of sexual violence in Oregon.
Great. Thank you so much for giving us that background. What about the Oregon Law Center?
Well, thanks. And I'm really excited to be here, actually, Tori. And this is Sybil. I have with the Oregon Law Center. And the Law Center is a non-LFC funded statewide low-income legal services provider. And so we are centered in Oregon. Our mission is to achieve justice for low-income populations in Oregon. And the way that we accomplish that is through the provision of civil legal assistance to low-income Oregonians. And we have offices across the state. Our primary role is to help people as they contact us to address the legal barriers and the barriers to justice that they're facing in their communities. And I serve as a policy advocate for the Law Center. Most of all of our staff essentially is dedicated to doing legal representation, but we have 2 individuals who try to address larger policy issues because we don't have enough funding to help every single person who needs individual legal assistance. So we do spend some of our resources trying to address policy change that will hopefully help reduce people's legal problems and therefore help solve problems on a larger scale. And the reason that we're really interested in domestic and sexual violence issues and really have focused a lot on domestic and sexual violence issues in the past is that so many of our clients come to us for help as they're struggling to escape or recover from domestic violence or sexual assault. And those issues just greatly contribute to the vulnerability of our clients and serve to further trap people in poverty and crisis. So we spend, as a policy advocate, I spend a significant portion of my time working on policy and legal solutions to try to help prevent and reduce the incidence of violence, but also to help improve our state's response. So that's what brings me to this discussion.
Great. Well, thank you, Michelle and Sybil, for giving us a background. And I think it's really
important that you made that connection between the work that you're doing to achieve justice for low-income folks, and then also seeing that so many of them were dealing with issues around sexual violence and domestic violence. And, I know that even in my own family, when folks have faced issues where they needed some type of legal assistance and not feeling like they were in a position to be able to afford that, knowing that there are agencies such as the Oregon Law Center available is so important to communities. So thank you so much for the work you're doing. And of course, Michelle, huge fan of the Oregon Attorney General Sexual Assault Task Force and the work that you all do. One of the reason that we wanted to talk to you so badly was because we are aware that Oregon recently passed what I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the first ever statewide rent stabilization bill. And I know that there was strong support from the anti-violence community. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the bill.
Well, thank you. And this is Sybil, and I'll jump in and just describe a little bit about the policy bill and kind of what it does. And you're right, it was or is the first statewide rent stabilization bill. So we're extremely proud of that and really excited about this proposal, really hopefully laying the groundwork for future work in other states and ideally at the national level. The reason the Law Center got involved in this issue is that, as you might imagine, housing and housing stability is also a huge issue for our clients. And the housing crisis that's impacting Oregon has just been immense, and vacancy rates are incredibly low, and rents are incredibly high. Supply is really low, and we are having a huge influx of population moving into our state. So the crisis has just, and the pressure points have just really been at fever pitch. And we have realized that this crisis is having a hugely disproportionate impact on our most vulnerable clients, including survivors. And looking at sort of the overlap of those issues, we realized that housing stability and the eviction crisis and the rent crisis were just having a kind of a double whammy effect on clients and populations that we really wanted to help. And so the bill is a real, I think, success for our communities across the state. And it does two things. And one is it prohibits eviction without cause in most tenancies. Before in Oregon, a landlord could evict a tenant at any time without any reason through the use of what's called a no-cause notice. And so we were noticing mass displacement of clients and communities through the use of no-cause notices, and also extreme rent increases. So we were seeing clients with 100%, 200% rent increases. And, I know my family couldn't absorb a 200% jump in my housing costs with very, very little notice. And so those became really the functional equivalent of an eviction. So those two pieces were very important to us, and those issues are what brought us to that bill. And I don't want to talk for too long, so I can go into more detail if you'd like more detail about the proposals.
When we had talked before, we had talked about our no cause notice, no cause eviction, and how these dramatic rent increases are acting as vehicles for eviction. And like you had said, they have such a disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable Oregonians too. So you talked a little bit about how the housing crisis in Oregon affects survivors, but I'm wondering now if we can talk a little bit more about how rent stabilization and eliminating no-cause evictions supports prevention of sexual and domestic violence.
One of the things that I think many of us recognize, and the data tells us, is that people who experience housing instability, displacement, homelessness, also experience high levels of sexual and domestic violence. And we know it's particularly true for women, communities of color, LGBTQ youth, who are also experiencing disproportionately higher rates of sexual violence. So would say in Oregon, where we've witnessed those drastic rent increases and no-cause evictions, the precarious nature of that housing instability has absolutely increased the likelihood of perpetration of sexual violence. I think all of us here on the call know we are more likely to experience sexual and domestic violence perpetrated by someone we know, and our experience in Oregon is that that's very true, that for folks experiencing housing instability, displacement, and homelessness, that they're experiencing violence from those that they go to for help, and that can be in the form of forced, manipulated sexual activity in exchange for a place to sleep, food, and other means of survival. And so strengthening our policies to support housing stability, we acknowledge and recognize as a protective factor that reduces the risks of perpetration. And I think that's where this bill connected very kind of perfectly with the goals of prevention in our community.
Yeah, Michelle, and I know that, we've done a lot around the strategies and approaches that the CDC technical packages identified as being able to prevent sexual and domestic violence. And I know that strengthening economic supports, I believe that's in both the sexual violence and intimate partner violence technical packages. So absolutely, I see this connects so, seamlessly to act as a buffer to multiple risk factors, really.
When we had our original call and we were chatting about this bill, it was pretty soon after it was passed that we got to sit down. So one of the pieces of that conversation that really stood out to me that I would love for us to talk about again for our Prevent Connect audience, we had talked about how no-cause evictions are essentially a mechanism of discrimination. So I'm wondering if you all wouldn't mind just having kind of explaining that process and having that conversation with us again.
Great. And this is Sybil, and thanks for that question. And I think most states, including Oregon, have statutory protections against discrimination and against retaliation. And, that has been true in Oregon for decades. But what we found is that with the increased housing pressures and the housing crisis, the market has been so intensely in favor of the landlord that, people who are prone to being bad actors or not complying with discrimination or retaliation protections could use no-cause notices kind of with impunity. In a way that really undermined the protections that are so important to so many of our communities. So, for example, a person who was being harassed by her landlord or being harassed by another tenant or wanting to assert her right to a repair that was important to the safety of the household. People are afraid to make those complaints or afraid to bring forward their rights because the landlord had the power under our prior law to issue a no-cause notice, which was essentially just impossible to challenge. So if there was a no-cause notice that was issued, you were looking at a 30-day or a 60-day window within which you had to find another apartment or home in an extremely tight rental market where, rents were extremely high. And, what we were seeing was that people were, either choosing not to protect themselves or assert their rights, or they were finding themselves really facing the threat of homelessness because of the no-cause notice. And just as an example, one of our clients called us because she had gotten a no-cause notice after she had dialed 911. And this is a common scenario that we, I think, have heard and seen across the nation, really. Our state statutes prohibit discrimination against victims calling 911, and yet if a landlord uses a no-cause notice, it's extremely hard to challenge that. And, this person was facing potential homelessness because of her effort to protect herself. So that's just one example.
that puts people in such a difficult position,
Yeah.
To have to choose between the possibility of facing homelessness or staying in an unsafe environment, whether it's not safe
Absolutely.
because of, violence that's happening
Mm-hmm.
or just because of like physical, issues in the residents.
The repair and
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
being able to assert your rights as a tenant too. I am so grateful that this bill passed and that will have such a positive impact across Oregon. I think what's really interesting to think about with this is, we're talking about housing, we're talking about sexual and intimate partner violence prevention and response. And I feel like that connection maybe isn't always super clear for folks because we are so used to, speaking from being in a sexual and intimate violence prevention practitioner role, we're so used to working in silos and having very little opportunity in the past to collaborate and form partnerships with other key sectors like housing, like you all have been able to do. So I'm wondering if you all can describe how you were able to collaborate and to bring a sexual and domestic violence prevention and response lens to this process and to this rent stabilization bill.
As you all know, I'm not a prevention expert, and so I'm still learning this piece and really just have been this is Sybil, so grateful to the Sexual Assault Task Force and to Michelle for kind of helping to give us some of the words that we needed to describe the prevention impact. I feel like at Legal Aid, we were able to kind of sense that there was something out there, and Michelle and the Sexual Assault Task Force, I think, really helped us begin to learn how to talk about the prevention aspects.
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sybil, and I appreciate actually that introduction because I'll admit I'm not sure that we actually considered that what we were doing was bringing a prevention and response lens to the process in this bill, but it makes sense when we think about it, and when we think about response and prevention as opposite sides of the same coin, and it also makes sense when we consider the role of oppression and inequity in which violence is rooted. And so kind of going back to some of the previous comments that Sybil made and thinking about displacement and housing instability and those folks who are disproportionately impacted in those situations being so connected to folks who are disproportionately impacted by violence. And so when we look at those root causes of both housing instability and displacement and the root causes of domestic and sexual violence, they're very much connected. And so while I don't think we actively considered that we were bringing that lens to this work, I think it's just so inherent in not only the mission of the organizations and the many partners who came together. It was much broader than the task force and the law center, of course, but that the mission and kind of underlying drive was recognizing those very root forms of violence and root causes of inequity in our communities. And so with this alliance, we were able to identify that together, certainly we were stronger in this effort, and that in and of itself, those kind of positive relationships, as we know, is a protective factor against violence. And so I appreciate that even without having those open conversations and more actively thinking about how response and prevention lens together contributed to this effort, we kind of naturally did that just as a way of that was the kind of foundation of where we came from and the ultimate goal of passing this bill.
Could I so echo those comments, and I feel like really kind of everything I do is sort of, I don't know I'm doing it before it happens, so that's very nice to hear you describe it that way. But I think I was just thinking as you were talking, Michelle, about a particular case that Legal Aid saw, and this particular no cause notice. It actually wasn't discriminatory. It was the closure of an entire building. And so everyone got a no cause notice. And that's another aspect of this dynamic is that, you'd have mass eviction. And this was in Grants Pass, Oregon. So it was a small town. And I think there were 60 units. I could be wrong about that number, but it was a large number of units, and everybody got an eviction. So they're all families, coming out into the tight rental market at the exact same time. And one of our clients, and she testified in the hearings. This is a public story, but she had a teenage daughter who was in her last year of high school. The notice came in the spring, and they had to be out. I think it was in March. And they couldn't find a place. And they spent, I think, all of their savings on 2 weeks in a motel, and then moved into the car because they didn't have anywhere else to go. And, as a result of all of this, her teenage daughter missed a lot of school, due to the stress, due to constantly not knowing where you were going to spend the night, and, all of the other challenges that came up, and she was no longer on track to graduate on time. And so, if you just think about, a young girl at that time in her life is already vulnerable to many of the, dynamics of violence or dating violence or assault, and those additional challenges, and just the trajectory that eviction notice caused for that whole family struck me as something that, if there's any way we can prevent that and all of the attendant damage, that's a huge policy priority for us. And I was also just going to say, I don't know if you've heard of the book Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and it does just a really great job of, I think, illustrating some of the extreme challenges that low and moderate income people have dealing with the rental and housing crisis. But Desmond, to Michelle, your point of the disproportionality, Desmond has a great quote, which is that if incarceration has come to define the lives of men from impoverished Black neighborhoods, eviction is shaping the lives of women. And he goes on to say, poor Black men were locked up and poor Black women were locked out. And just sort of thinking about it from a national perspective of an entire population is really being shut out of, homes, but also neighborhoods and communities and places where they're rooted, and all of the impacts of that.
Wow, thank you for sharing that book and that quote. We'll definitely link that in our blog so folks can find that if they're interested. Yeah, I mean, I think that as you were sharing that story, I was just thinking about how anytime that you start to strip people of like basic human needs, like housing, it creates such a ripple effect across all other areas of, their social interactions and relationships and all facets of life, really. And so it does feel like housing is such an important priority when we're trying to prevent not just sexual and domestic violence, but across violence types and other equitable conditions. So yeah, thank you so much for kind of leading us through that.